The story the world thinks it knows begins with a photograph and ends with a courtroom calendar. For years, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt were not just two famous people who fell in love. They were projected on billboards and magazine covers like a modern myth, a family that seemed too large, too beautiful, too purposeful to ever break. And then it did break, not with one clean crack, but with a long grinding sound that kept echoing long after the first headlines faded. 8 years is a long time to be in public limbo. Long enough for children to grow into adults while their parents are still arguing over what happened, what was promised, what was owed, what was protected, and what was taken. Long enough for strangers to turn fragments of legal language into certainty, and for certainty to harden into camps. Long enough that silence itself starts to feel like a statement. It is tempting to ask for a single dramatic moment, one scene you can point to and say, this is where everything ended. The public has always wanted that. A doorway slammed, a confession, a betrayal caught under flashbulbs. In their case, the moment most often cited is a private flight in September 2016, a confined space where, according to allegations described in legal filings and reported by major outlets, an argument escalated and left Jolie saying she was acting to protect her children. Authorities investigated, including the FBI, and no charges were filed, a fact that sits uneasily beside the permanence of the accusations because legal closure does not always produce emotional closure. 5 days after that flight, Jolie filed for divorce. And from there, the separation became something more than a breakup. It became an endurance test. In 2019, they were declared legally single through a bifurcated process that separated marital status from the unresolved disputes that remained. To the outside world, that sounds like an ending. In reality, it was only a change of labels while the most difficult parts continued to unfold behind closed doors. What makes this saga so consuming is not only the celebrity of the names, but the collision of two narratives that refuse to merge. One side frames the story as a mother choosing safety and stability after a frightening rupture. The other frames it as a man confronting addiction and personal failure, insisting he is not the monster the world wants to cast, and fighting not to be erased from his children's lives. Both narratives contain pain. Both narratives seek legitimacy. And because so many details are sealed, negotiated, or disputed, the public fills the gaps with imagination, the most dangerous kind of certainty. There is another layer, quieter but just as revealing, that turns the divorce into a parable about what love leaves behind when it is converted into property. Château Miraval was once described as a shared dream, a French estate and winery that symbolized a private refuge from fame. After the split, it became a battlefield of contracts and consent. Pitt sued after Jolie sold her stake through her company to Tenuta del Mondo, a buyer linked to the Stoli Group's Yuri Scheffler, arguing the sale violated prior understandings about mutual approval. Jolie's side has pushed back in court, arguing her reasons included not wanting to remain tied to an asset weighted by trauma and dispute. Even after the divorce settlement was reached, Miraval continued as its own separate war, cold and procedural, like a second marriage made only of documents. And then, late in 2024, a word finally appeared that many thought would never come. Settlement. Multiple reputable outlets reported that Jolie and Pitt reached a divorce settlement at the end of December 2024, more than 8 years after the filing. The reporting emphasized exhaustion and relief, not triumph. No victory lap, no romantic epilogue, just a door that finally closes after you have forgotten what it felt like to live without it looming in the background. If you listen closely, that is the hook hiding beneath the glamour. This is not a story about a perfect couple collapsing. It is a story about what happens when a private rupture becomes a public institution, a machine that keeps moving long after the feelings that started to have burned out. It is a story about the cost of silence, the cost of speaking, and a strange way a life can be measured in filings, hearings, and delays, while the human heart is measured in sleepless nights and the small, unseen decisions made for children. The script begins by framing Angelina Jolie as someone the world watches too closely and understands too little. Flawless face on one side, secrets and wounds on the other. That framing matters because it sets up a moral logic where every relationship becomes less about ordinary compatibility and more about refuge, someone to hold the chaos at bay. In that logic, love is not just affection, it is shelter. The first shelter the transcript offers is Johnny Lee Miller, presented not as a scandal or a trophy, but as an anchor. Their story is told with deliberate intimacy, rooftops after filming, cigarettes, late-night confessions about fear and growing up. The details are cinematic, possibly embellished, but their function is clear. They establish a young Jolie who wants to be seen without being consumed. And then comes the emblematic moment that has been repeated in pop culture for years. The wedding in 1996, where she reportedly wore a white shirt and wrote his name in blood. Whether one reads it as romance, performance, or a cry for control, the transcript treats it as the purest form of devotion, reckless, youthful, and sincere. Then it pivots to the quiet end. No screaming, no hatred, just distance and exhaustion. That peaceful breakup motif is important because it becomes a contrast later. The narrator is essentially saying, Jolie knows how to leave without war. Therefore, if a war happened later, it must have been because the circumstances were beyond normal. From there, the script moves to Billy Bob Thornton, described as older, wild, already carrying the weathered edges of multiple marriages. The relationship is framed as a blaze, fast, public, and unrestrained. Again, symbolism is used as shorthand. Vials of blood, tattoos, a kind of love that dares the world to judge it. It is not subtle. It is the opposite of the quiet rooftop conversations with Miller. And the transcript's implication is that Jolie swung from one extreme to another because she was still trying to define what love meant when fame keeps rewriting your boundaries. The script then introduces the first major shift, Maddox. In this telling, motherhood is not a side plot. It is the turning point that changes the axis of Jolie's life from romance to responsibility. The narrator claims Thornton could not share the weight of that responsibility, and the relationship faded into a silence similar to her first divorce. No public spectacle, no scorched earth accusations, only the feeling that two people who once burned brightly now needed different air to breathe. That is the prelude the transcript insists you absorb before it even says Brad Pitt's name. Because when it finally arrives, Brad Pitt, it is not presented as just another relationship, but as the greatest, deepest love and the hinge that redefines her identity. This is also where the script begins to slide from biography into mythology. It positions Pitt as a force powerful enough to tear down every emotional barrier, a love that is both radiant and consuming. The point is not neutrality. The point is magnitude. Then the cultural shockwave appears. Mr. and Mrs. Smith in 2004. Pitt still married to Jennifer Aniston, and the idea of a connection that could not be hidden. The transcript describes their bond as inevitable, but also acknowledges the cost. Once Pitt's marriage ended in early 2005, the story says everything exploded. Here the language becomes less personal and more societal. Newspapers, television, the couple's nickname turning into a global label. The love story stops belonging to them and begins belonging to everyone. This is where the transcript tries to make you feel the difference between a romance and a machine. A romance lives in private moments. A machine lives in headlines. The narrator lists the elements that made Brangelina feel unbreakable: the humanitarian work, the public idealism, the family growing across continents. Shiloh's birth in Namibia is framed as an act of defiance against paparazzi. Pax's adoption is framed as expansion of a shared mission. The twins' birth in France is framed as the family becoming a kind of traveling country of its own. The details are arranged like a collage meant to prove that this was not an affair that lasted. It was a life that was built. The transcript also weaves in pain to deepen the bond. Jolie's mother's death in 2007 becomes an abyss that Pitt helps her survive. Then comes a medically specific moment. Jolie's public discussion of carrying a BRCA mutation and her decision to undergo preventive surgeries. That part of the narrative is rooted in well-known public reporting from the time, and the transcript uses it as evidence that their love faced something harsher than gossip. Mortality, fear, the body changing, the question of whether intimacy survives loss. Even in a dramatized script, that is the kind of scene audiences remember because it feels recognizably human. Only after building this long runway does the transcript begin to hint at the fracture. Two ambitious lives pulling in different directions, pressures from work and fame, parenting disagreements, exhaustion. It paints the home as gradually colder, quieter, more distant. In other words, it is setting the stage for why the eventual collapse would not be a simple "we grew apart" narrative, but something heavier, more frightening, and more legally consequential, something that could plausibly end in allegations, investigations, and the kind of litigation that dragged on until a reported settlement in late December 2024. By the time Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt finally married in 2014, the relationship had already lived a full decade under pressure that most couples never face in a lifetime. The transcript treats that wedding, private, child-centered, sealed away from spectacle, as a quiet declaration, not a grand beginning, but an affirmation after years of shared history. In that framing, marriage is not the spark, it is the stamp. And that is exactly why the collapse that follows is narrated like a tragedy rather than a breakup. When a couple has already survived the storms, the audience assumes the ship is unsinkable. The script's job is to show you the hidden waterline crack. It starts with a familiar culprit, divergence. Two ambitious people can grow in the same direction for years, and then, slowly, their growth vectors begin to angle away from each other. In the transcript, Jolie's focus intensifies around directing and humanitarian work, projects with moral gravity, political stakes, and emotional weight. Pitt's life tilts toward production, films, investments, and the kind of long-term strategy that does not always align with the urgent, field-driven rhythm of activism. Neither path is painted as wrong. The fracture comes from the friction between them, the constant negotiation of time, control, and priorities inside a household already carrying the complexity of 6 children. Then the narrative introduces a more intimate shift, mood. The transcript doesn't just describe schedules, it describes atmosphere. A home that once felt alive becomes colder and quieter. Calls become logistical rather than affectionate. The "I miss you" disappears, replaced by long silences that do not resolve into tenderness. This is where the script begins to change genres, from romance biography to psychological drama, because silence is not presented as neutral. Silence becomes evidence of emotional separation, a room filling with unspoken resentment. The hinge point in the transcript is By the Sea, 2015, the film Jolie directed and starred in, about a married couple disintegrating. The script treats the project as a mirror they willingly stepped into. Publicly, it was art, a creative experiment. Privately, according to the narrator, it functioned like exposure therapy without safety rails, reenacting the shape of misery until the reenactment starts to feel real. Whether or not that is fair to the actual people behind the story, it is a powerful narrative move because it turns their work into prophecy. It implies that what audiences watched as fiction was already happening under the surface. Next comes the escalation: substance use, emotional volatility, and fear. The transcript claims Pitt drank more, while Jolie grew quieter, retreating into loneliness and anxiety. It portrays the relationship as a widening gulf where one person externalizes pain and the other internalizes it. This is a classic storytelling device. One partner becomes a storm, the other becomes a shelter that starts to collapse from the inside. Again, the language is not cautious. It is written to pull the audience toward a single conclusion. The marriage was no longer simply strained. It was unsafe. And then the transcript delivers the sharp blade. September 15, 2016. The private flight from Nice to Los Angeles is described as the moment everything left the realm of emotional injury and entered the realm of legal consequence. The script recounts allegations that Pitt, intoxicated and out of control, grabbed Jolie by the throat, yelled at their son Maddox, and spilled beer on Jolie and the children. It describes Jolie's injuries and Maddox's reaction, standing between them, as if the child became the boundary line the adults had failed to draw. In the transcript, that image is the moral centerpiece. A teenage son placed in the role of protector, a role no child should have to perform. From there, the story becomes procedural. Jolie calls a lawyer. 5 days later, she files for divorce. Those details matter because they're designed to show immediacy, not deliberation. The transcript wants you to feel that the decision was not strategic or calculated, but urgent, an emergency response. It also presents the investigative aftermath. Authorities look into what happened. No criminal charges are filed, and yet the emotional verdict inside the family is portrayed as final. This is one of the transcript's strongest themes. Legal closure can coexist with lasting relational rupture. The narrative then shifts to consequences that linger long after headlines move on. It claims that the children's relationships with Pitt deteriorated dramatically. Maddox allegedly never saw his father again. Other children purportedly distanced themselves, and some reportedly dropped Pitt from their names. Whether every detail holds up in the real world is less important to the script than what those details symbolize: erasure. The transcript frames the aftermath as a family reconstituting itself around the mother, with the father becoming a ghost at the edge of the picture. At the same time, it acknowledges a competing arc for Pitt: rehabilitation, therapy, and an attempt at behavioral control. This is crucial because a story that paints one side as purely villain and the other as purely victim tends to feel cheap. The transcript tries to avoid that by inserting a partial redemption pathway. Pitt admitting he drank too much, seeking help, trying to stabilize. But it never lets that arc outrun the core allegation. It is more regretful man than restored father, more too late than turnaround. Public reaction becomes its own character. The transcript describes the divorce as a global shock, a collective mourning of a myth, followed by an immediate split into camps. Those who see Jolie as a mother protecting children from harm, and those who question her motives scrutinize her claims, or interpret the story through loyalty to Pitt's star persona. That polarization is not incidental. It is part of why celebrity divorces metastasize. The public is not a spectator. It becomes a pressure force, shaping reputations, fueling narratives, and rewarding certainty even when certainty is impossible. Then the transcript describes the legal years as a long, expensive, emotionally draining loop. Communication through lawyers, therapists, hearings, rulings, appeals, reversals, and continued disputes. The details in the script about custody outcomes are presented with strong finality, but the broader point is the same regardless of exact legal endpoints. The conflict did not end quickly, and the prolonged process became its own kind of captivity. Jolie's silence is framed not as coldness, but as a sanctuary, protection from a world that would happily consume every private detail if allowed. After the plane incident and the filing, the story did not move toward closure the way most people imagine divorces do. It expanded. What had begun as a personal rupture turned into a multi-front conflict in which time itself became the enemy. The transcript describes the years after 2016 as a kind of prolonged fog. Paperwork replacing conversation, court dates replacing anniversaries, and the ordinary work of raising children becoming inseparable from legal strategy. Whether you view that as protection or punishment depends on which narrative you trust, but the human outcome is the same. Life is lived under a ceiling that never quite lifts. One of the most psychologically corrosive elements in long-running separations is the disappearance of direct communication. The transcript emphasizes that the couple rarely spoke face-to-face, that messages moved through lawyers, and that even parenting became mediated by therapists and legal terms. This matters because it changes how people relate. If every sentence might become evidence, sincerity becomes dangerous. If every compromise might be interpreted as weakness, flexibility disappears. Over time, the conflict stops being about the original injury and becomes about identity. Who is the responsible parent? Who is the stable adult? Who is the truthful narrator? Who is the one protecting the children? Who is the one being unfairly punished? In that environment, peace is not simply a decision. Peace is an ecosystem, and ecosystems take years to rebuild. The transcript also leans into a difficult truth about celebrity divorce. The public does not just observe it, the public participates in it. Headlines become emotional weapons. Rumors become leverage. A single anonymous source can reshape reputations overnight. And because the audience feels they know these people, they treat the breakup like a referendum on character. Jolie becomes either the brave mother or the calculating strategist. Pitt becomes either the broken man in recovery or the dangerous figure whose charm masked harm. The social media era intensifies this because nuance is rarely rewarded. The strongest, simplest story wins, even when the truth is complex, partial, or sealed behind confidentiality agreements. Inside that noise, the transcript frames Jolie's strategy as retreat, not hiding out of shame, but withdrawing to control the environment around her children. It presents her as someone who learned, painfully, that privacy is not a luxury. It is a form of safety. In that framing, stepping away from Hollywood is not rejection of fame. It is refusal to let fame parent her family. The story repeatedly returns to one core idea. Love has changed shape. It is no longer romantic. It is protective. It is the architecture of a home built to keep the outside world from turning a child's pain into entertainment. At the same time, the transcript gives Pitt his own form of reconstruction, though it keeps the tone restrained, almost guarded. It describes him confronting alcohol, entering therapy, and attempting to stabilize his life. This is not presented as a triumphant redemption arc. It is framed as damage control after the fact, a necessary but insufficient response. The subtext is clear. Even if he becomes healthier, the relationship damage has already been done, and trust is not something sobriety can automatically restore. In these stories, recovery is always complicated by timing. The person who needed change may change, but the people who are hurt may already be living in a different emotional universe. And then there is the question that often outlives the marriage itself. What happens to the shared symbols? The transcript treats Château Miraval as the most important symbol of all. It is described as more than a property, an emblem of the life they built, the place where they married, the site of family memory and public branding. In most divorces, assets are divided and life moves on. In a celebrity divorce, assets can become narrative battlegrounds because they are not only money, they are identity. Keeping or losing Miraval is not just about wealth. It is about who gets to keep the story, who gets to keep the dream, and who is forced to walk away from the physical evidence that the dream once felt real. That is why the Miraval conflict, sale, consent, lawsuits, counterclaims, fits perfectly into the transcript's theme. When love ends badly, even the most beautiful places become heavy. A vineyard stops being romantic and starts being a contract. A chateau stops being a home and becomes a line item with legal footnotes. The transcript frames Jolie's attempt to sever ties as an act of survival. She no longer wants to be connected to a property that, in her mind, is inseparable from trauma. It frames Pitt's opposition as a mix of betrayal and principle. He does not want an unwanted partner imposed on him, and he sees the sale as a violation of prior agreements. In other words, both sides can claim logic, and that is what makes the dispute so cold. Logic does not heal, it only justifies. This part of the story also clarifies why the public often misunderstands settlement. Even if a divorce reaches a legal endpoint, that does not mean the war is over. It means one chapter is closed while others remain open. custody arrangements evolving as children age, property disputes continuing, reputational aftershocks lingering in interviews, documentaries, and the next generation's choices about what name they carry. The transcript repeatedly returns to the idea that the cost of divorce extends beyond emotion and finances. It extends into the future, shaping careers, friendships, and family dynamics long after the court documents are filed away. Finally, Part 4 introduces what the transcript wants you to see as the first real sign of transformation. Not a reunion, not forgiveness, but redirection. Jolie moves toward work that is framed as legacy, creative leadership, projects tied to meaning, spaces designed around compassion. Pitt moves toward quieter living, relationships kept out of the spotlight, a life built around stability rather than spectacle. The transcript's message is not that either of them wins. It is that both of them, in different ways, are attempting to survive the same disaster. And that is the uncomfortable takeaway. Sometimes the end of a great love is not a dramatic final scene. It is a long, administrative process that drains people until they become strangers to their former selves. The rebuilding, when it finally starts, is rarely loud. It is small choices made daily. How to spend time, how to speak, how to protect children, how to live with a past that cannot be erased. A key move the transcript makes is to redefine what breaking silence means. It does not present Jolie as suddenly giving a detailed, explicit account. Instead, it frames her as offering fragments, statements about dishonesty, about feeling like she was not herself, about surviving because of her children. In other words, the silence that breaks is not necessarily a release of facts. It is a release of internal truth. That distinction matters because it is exactly how many public figures speak when the legal and personal consequences of specificity are still too heavy. They do not litigate the details in interviews. They reveal the emotional cost. The transcript's portrait of Jolie in these years is built on 3 claims: exhaustion, protection, and reinvention. Exhaustion comes first. It suggests that the prolonged conflict drained her, that she lived as if walking through fog, unable to feel fully alive. This is classic post-trauma language, the sense of dissociation that can occur when life becomes about survival rather than growth. Even if the viewer does not know clinical terms, they recognize the sensation, waking up and feeling like you are operating, not living. The transcript uses this fog metaphor to justify why she stepped away from Hollywood. Not because she lost relevance or ambition, but because the environment became incompatible with healing. In that framing, Hollywood is not merely a workplace. It is a trigger, a place where every camera flash reminds you that private pain is public currency. Protection is the second pillar. The transcript makes a strategic argument. Her children were the anchor, the reason she did not collapse, and therefore the primary mission became building a home where they could breathe. That is why it returns repeatedly to the idea that love is no longer romantic. Love is protection and growth. This is a powerful reframing because it neutralizes the public's most common expectation, that a celebrity divorce must produce either scandal or new romance. Instead, the transcript says the romance ended, but love did not. It simply changed target and definition. Reinvention is the third pillar, and it is where the story tries to become hopeful without becoming naive. The transcript points to 2 symbolic arenas, Broadway and fashion. Broadway, through The Outsiders, is framed as creative leadership and intergenerational connection, especially because the transcript emphasizes her working as a producer with her daughter. This is not just a career pivot. It is positioned as a reclaiming of agency. The actress who was once defined by roles becomes a builder of platforms. A producer is someone who makes the conditions for stories to exist. In narrative terms, that is a perfect metaphor for what the transcript wants you to believe Jolie is doing with her life, creating conditions for a future that is not hostage to the past. Fashion, through Atelier Jolie, is framed as sustainable creativity and social purpose, a place where those once abandoned by the world can be connected to craftsmanship and respect. This is the transcript's way of translating humanitarian identity into a tangible, culturally resonant form. The underlying message is straightforward. She is shifting from being a symbol on a screen to being a person who builds real-world structures, projects that outlast gossip. Notice what the transcript avoids. It avoids depicting Jolie as triumphant in a conventional sense. Even when it says she felt relief after the divorce ended, it insists she did not feel happiness. Relief is framed as stepping out of a suffocating room, not walking into a party. That choice is deliberate. It keeps the tone credible to audiences who understand that trauma does not dissolve because paperwork ends. It also keeps the story emotionally grounded. Survival first, joy later, maybe. On the other side, the transcript treats Pitt's post-divorce narrative as a controlled rehabilitation story. Sobriety, therapy, stabilization, and then a quieter relationship with Inesta Ramon. Again, the script is careful with tone. It does not describe him as redeemed in the eyes of his family. It describes him as more loveless than ever in the public eye, then explains how he tried to rebuild privately. This is a subtle but important distinction. Public perception is not the same as private reality. A person can be improving while still being distrusted. A person can be stable while still being excluded. Improvement does not automatically reopen doors that were slammed in fear. The transcript description of Pitt's quieter romance is also doing symbolic work. It is meant to contrast the era of Brangelina, the blazing spotlight, the ideology as brand, the power couple myth, with something dimmer and calmer. The implication is that Pitt, whether by choice or necessity, has learned that high-intensity visibility is not love, is pressure. A low-profile relationship is framed as peace, as an emotional anchor, rather than a headline machine. The first thing the transcript does in this closing stretch is strip romance of its glamour. It argues, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that passion is not proof of safety. In the earlier chapters, passion was everywhere. Rooftop cigarettes with Miller, blood vial symbolism with Thornton, the explosive chemistry with Pitt. The script treats those images as seductive but incomplete. They are beautiful on camera, but they are not sufficient for a life that includes children, careers, and psychological history. By the time we reach the aftermath, passion has been demoted. The highest value is not intensity, it is stability. That reframing is the emotional core of the finally breaks silence claim. The transcript is not interested in the courtroom's version of truth as much as the lived version. How it feels to realize that what once looked like destiny has become a threat. It suggests that Jolie's rare public reflections about dishonesty, about being lost, about surviving for her children, are not gossip. They are boundary markers. They are her way of telling the world. The story you enjoyed as entertainment had consequences that did not end when the credits rolled. The transcript's second closing move is to elevate motherhood as the primary moral lens. Jolie's children are not used as props. They're depicted as the axis around which all choices spin. Whether or not every detail in the transcript is verifiable, the narrative intent is consistent. A mother's love is portrayed as the force that prevented collapse, the force that justified retreat, and the force that inspired reinvention. When Jolie says, in the script's telling, that she would not have survived without her children, it is not positioned as sentimentality. It is positioned as strategy, an identity shift from partner to protector. This is important because celebrity narratives often flatten women into archetypes: the seductress, the victim, the ice queen, the manipulator. The transcript tries to counter that flattening by arguing that Jolie's choices are coherent when viewed through the lens of protection. In that sense, silence becomes an ethical stance rather than a PR tactic. She is silent because she refuses to let her children's pain be mined for content. The third move is a controlled handling of Pitt's rehabilitation. The transcript acknowledges the public reporting and common storyline of him confronting alcohol and pursuing therapy, but does not let that become a clean redemption. It's closer to a sobering observation. A person can change and still be living with consequences that change cannot undo. In business terms, the transcript is describing reputational damage and relational loss as liabilities that do not disappear when a corrective action plan is implemented. Progress matters, but outcomes remain uncertain. This is why the script spends time contrasting loud love and quiet love. Loud love, Brangelina, was high visibility, high pressure, constantly validated and punished by the public. Quiet love, the later relationship attributed to Pitt, is described as private, steadier, free from constant judgment. The transcript implies that this quieter approach is not merely preference, it is adaptation. When a public relationship collapses in public, privacy becomes a form of self-preservation. Then the transcript returns to the theme of legacy. Jolie's Broadway producing and the positioning of Atelier Jolie are not introduced merely to show she is busy. They are presented as evidence of a broader philosophical shift, from being defined by personal relationships to being defined by the systems one builds. The narrator wants you to see her as an architect of meaning, someone constructing projects where creativity intersects with compassion. This is the narrative's way of replacing the divorced celebrity identity with creator and mother identity, a transformation that feels empowering without needing to declare victory over an ex-husband. In the transcript's final moral framing, the biggest lesson is about letting go. It states, in effect, that loving does not always mean holding on. Sometimes it means walking away so that growth remains possible. That line is emotionally resonant because it applies to viewers' lives, not just to celebrities. It is also a strategic storytelling move. It converts a messy legal saga into a universal takeaway. Viewers who came for drama leave with a self-help conclusion, which is one reason these celebrity narratives perform well. They satisfy curiosity and deliver catharsis. But there is a quiet tension in the transcript's ending, and it is worth naming. The script wants closure, yet the reality of this story, especially with ongoing disputes around assets like Miraval, suggests that closure is partial. Even when a divorce is settled, memory remains. Even when litigation ends, a family history does not reset. Even when two people stop speaking, the children still carry the imprint of what they witnessed. The transcript gestures at this by describing Jolie as someone who has just left a battlefield, not someone who has reached a destination. Healing is a direction, not a finish line. That is the final image it offers. Storms pass, and the heart can beat again, slowly, steadily, toward peace. Not the shiny piece of a fairy tale, but the practical piece of waking up and feeling a little less trapped than yesterday. The first element of this landing is tone. The narrator deliberately softens the language. The story is no longer framed as a burning romance or a courtroom thriller. It is framed as a journey, an emotional ballad, a long road where pain becomes raw material for strength. This shift is not accidental. Most viewers who consume celebrity drama do not want to end in paperwork. They want to end in meaning. So the transcript reframes the conflict as a crucible, something that strips away illusions and forces a person to decide what matters. In that reframing, Angelina Jolie is presented as a figure of recalibration. The transcript emphasizes that she no longer seeks to prove anything to the world. The earlier Angelina, defined by daring symbols, provocative romance, and the thrill of being misunderstood, is replaced by a quieter person who chooses stillness, truth, and freedom. The story calls this rebirth, but it is careful to define rebirth as something practical. Building a home, protecting children, selecting projects with purpose, and withdrawing from environments that turn vulnerability into commodity. The script's most consistent claim is that her children became the center of gravity, not merely a comforting detail, but the organizing principle of her identity. When the transcript says she wouldn't have survived without them, it is offering a model of resilience rooted in responsibility. The subtext is that survival is not always heroic. Sometimes it is parental. Sometimes you keep going because someone needs you to be functional, even when you do not feel whole. From there, the transcript expands the concept of love. It insists that love is not necessarily romance, not necessarily fireworks, and not necessarily a private sanctuary. Love becomes protection and growth. This is a powerful rhetorical move because it allows the narrator to keep the story about love even after the couple has shattered. It keeps the audience emotionally invested while repositioning the moral center away from the relationship and onto the family's future. Brad Pitt's role in this final section is more complicated. The transcript does not try to fully condemn him, but it does not fully absolve him either. Instead, it portrays him as someone who emerged from the split more loveless than ever in public perception, then describes his attempts to stabilize, sobriety, therapy, and a quieter, less exposed personal life. The narrative intent is to show contrast. Where the Brangelina era was ablaze, the post-Brangelina era is a dimmer light. Whether that dimness is peace, consequence, or both is left unresolved. That unresolved quality is important. If the transcript ended by declaring one person good and the other evil, it would feel like propaganda. Instead, it ends with a safer moral. Relationships can be toxic, and sometimes leaving is the only way to preserve what is worth saving. It implies, without explicitly litigating, that harm can exist even in a love story that looked perfect from the outside. And it suggests that people can try to change after harm, but the people who were hurt are not obligated to re-enter the same space. The transcript then returns to legacy, because legacy is the only kind of closure that feels larger than gossip. Jolie's projects, Broadway producing, Atelier Jolie, humanitarian work, are presented as evidence that she is writing a new chapter in which her value is not defined by who she loved, but by what she builds. This is the final pivot from celebrity relationship to human trajectory. The narrator emphasizes craft, compassion, and intergenerational connection, particularly through work shared with her daughter. That detail functions like a seal on a new identity, not a romantic partner, but a creator and mother shaping what comes next. The last moral lesson is delivered in a clean, audience-facing way. Loving does not always mean holding on. Sometimes it means letting go so both sides can grow freely. The transcript frames this as wisdom earned through pain, a mature understanding that contrasts with the earlier depictions of impulsive passion. It is essentially offering a before and after model. Youth equals intensity and symbolism. Maturity equals boundaries and responsibility. Then the narrator broadens the lens one final time, pulling the viewer into the story's why. The point is not that celebrities suffer more. It is that celebrity makes suffering visible, monetized, and distorted. In that world, even healing becomes a performance risk. That is why silence is presented as a form of power. Not the power to control the public, but the power to refuse participation in the public's appetite. Finally, the transcript ends in the tone of reassurance. Storms pass. Hearts beat again. Peace can be rebuilt. It is not a promise of perfection. It is a promise of movement, a slow return to breath after years of constriction. In that sense, the final image is deliberately modest. Not fireworks, not reconciliation, not a glamorous new romance, but the ordinary miracle of stability. And the story leaves one lingering question, whether it intends to or not. When the world watches a relationship collapse, who is the story really for? The people who lived it or the people who consumed it?